Okay, so thank you for coming today to listen to my webinar on extra-familial harm, an overview of the contextual safeguarding approach. My name is Clive Diaz. I am a research associate at Cascade, Cardiff University, and earlier this year I worked for 4 or 5 months for the contextual safeguarding team at the University of Bedfordshire, Carlene Firmin's team. And today I'm going to be drawing on a research project that was actually carried out last summer and through into the early part of this winter with some colleagues at Cardiff University into 2 local authorities that have sought to implement the contextual safeguarding approach in different ways. So in terms of the session overview today, what the things we're covering are we're going to think about how the current system works, the current child protection system works, and how it works particularly with adolescents or the young people at risk of harm. And we're going to think about how it might improve. We're going to look at the contextual safeguarding approach, challenges and opportunities, particularly around its implementation and what might assist in local authorities. And then we're going to look at what the research says fairly briefly. It suggests works with young people at risk of extra-familial harm, so around relationship building, and draw on some key research in that area. So just to start then, just want to highlight some examples of the risks adolescents potentially face. Child sexual exploitation is obviously one that's been happening very far for a number of years. Also child criminal exploitation. Awareness and understanding of how young people are increasingly at risk of child obviously there can be violence in teenage relationships, running away, missing from home is a significant risk for adolescents, bullying in schools, but also in the community, potential involvement in gangs or so-called gangs. Also, there can be drug and alcohol misuse and getting involved in all sorts of criminal activity, lack of exercise, obesity, health issues. So lots of potential risks adolescents can face. We're going to be focusing more on child sexual exploitation, child criminal exploitation, violence, those sorts of things missing from home today. But important to bear in mind, there's a whole raft of risks that young people adolescents can face in the community. So the problem that we need to think about is, particularly around child sexual exploitation, is Sophie Hallett's done a lot of research in Wales and has published internationally. She has highlighted in a recent review of practice in Wales that there's a great deal of variance in where social workers and other key professionals are around child sexual exploitation, and a great variance in terms of knowledge base around how we should be working with young people at risk of child sexual exploitation and indeed their families. She also highlights that there's limited evaluative research on the use of assessment protocols and their effectiveness. So for example, child sexual exploitation tools actually work? And there's new child sexual exploitation guidance out in Wales, or there's a small bit of it out now. There's going to be more guidance coming out and policy around child sexual exploitation in Wales over the next sort of 6 months, and that may well see a change in the use of tools and assessment protocols. There's also limited evidence around the effectiveness of interventions, so we're still not completely certain about what works with young people and their families who are at risk of child sexual exploitation. There's still more research needed in that area. And still relatively little research addressing what child sexual exploitation experience young people have to say about how exploitation can be best understood. And this is also an issue we see with contextual safeguarding and indeed many frameworks like the Science Safety, but in terms of contextual safeguarding, there hasn't been much research with parents or young people so far to gain their perspectives on that approach, and we'll come back to that. So one of the things we are aware of is this feeling that they do tend to feel done to. So Children's Commission in England carried out a report on child sexual exploitation. What they found was that children and young people told us repeatedly that being done to by agencies founded their sense of powerlessness. We see this across the child protection system, really, both parents and children often feeling done to. So working, telling them what's going to happen rather than working with them. And we need to definitely move our practice to working much more in partnership with parents and children. But we also need to do more research, really, alongside young people and parents. So they say they want to be partners in their protection recovery plans, and those that had their experience valued it. Those who had that experience valued it immensely and felt stronger for being involved. So really important that we do involve young people and parents much more in decision making when they're at risk of child sexual exploitation, and indeed more generally in our work with young. I just want to say a few things around adolescence. We know a meta-review highlighted by Peter Steigbottom that while incidents of significant harm for younger children almost occur exclusively first in adolescence, non-fatal incidents of significant outside the family. So really important to recognize actually for a lot of young people, they will when they're younger, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, up to sort of 10, 11, they're much more likely to suffer harm inside the family home. When you get a bit older, then 12, 13, 14, 15, most of the reviews of serious case reviews would say that harm is more likely to happen in the community rather than be inflicted by the parents. Still can, of course, be inflicted by parents or carers, but more likely to happen in the community. And I think this is a good quote from quite a while ago now, Siffert and Hoffman. As a child develops into an adolescent, the individuals that have the greatest influence on them, changes from their parents to peers. So this is a really important point to recognise and be aware of. So just earlier this year, long-awaited review of serious case reviews by Marion Brandon and colleagues. A really important report. I'm definitely recommending this. It's freely available on the internet. And what they suggested, they looked at a number of cases, but particularly adolescents. 1 in 3 of serious case reviews over, so that's a pretty high proportion. And the most common cause of serious harm in these cases were where young people had been victims of violent behaviour in the community, would be involved in some kind of risk-taking, potentially alongside other young people, or potentially victims of exploitation. And then child sexual exploitation was the other common cause. 10% of serious case reviews relate to child sexual exploitation. And as I said, I'd really recommend you read that report. It's an important report, and it says there's a number of emerging threats outside the home. So going missing, big concerns, obviously, when young people go missing, whether they're in care, whether they're not in care. Criminal exploitation could be that young people get exploited in criminal exploitation. They are used to move drugs, be involved in gangs, involved in violence, trafficking, these sorts of things. Sexual exploitation, we've already touched upon. Harmful sexual behaviour, increasing concern around that. And again, not a great deal of strong research on that issue. And radicalisation, of course. And they're particularly young people who are more likely to be at risk potentially. So adolescents feeling lonely and isolated or going missing may become particularly vulnerable to grooming and criminal or sexual exploitation. So important to think of the young people you're working with who are potentially feeling lonely and more isolated, and think about what extra support they can be offered. Another few key points from this very important triennial review by Marion Brandon and colleagues. It's important to recognise the relationship between adolescents' prior experience, their risk of harm. If you're thinking about a young person who's maybe experienced trauma, younger or ongoing trauma, it might be that they live in a home. You need to recognise that children who experience prolonged and persistent engagement and direct work alongside them really essential. An adolescent going missing is a strong sign that there are major issues, so we need to be very mindful of those young people who are going missing. And Mary and Brendan, search team there, very clear that local authorities should be offering prompt return interviews, and information from these interviews should be shared appropriately with other key agencies that are involved supporting that family. So really important that we're mindful of trauma that young people could have experienced in the past, and indeed ongoing trauma, of course, if they're then at risk of child sexual exploitation, child criminal exploitation. More and more local authorities are looking at using the trauma-informed approaches, and I think that can be a good way. We haven't got time. We're looking at doing another webinar on that subject, but I think that's a way that could be used to work with adolescents and young people at risk of child sexual exploitation. Although again, the evidence base still isn't that strong so far. So the triennial review also raised criminal exploitation as something that was coming up in their cases, closely linked to school exclusion, going missing, substance use, and we need to again be quote from Brandon's report: practitioners should find ways to understand and record patterns in adolescent group and individual behaviour to capture a holistic picture of the potential harm. So really important, a holistic assessment. And when we come to the contextual safeguarding approach, things like peer assessments, assessments of schools, these sorts of things can definitely help with this area of work. So I think it would be helpful just to take a couple of minutes for you to reflect on how your team and your agency work with young people at risk of approach, a contextual safeguarding approach. Okay, so I'll carry on now. Just a few more things about adolescence. This is a good quote from Barter et al. I think the nature of young people's neighbourhoods and schools and the relationships young people develop within these contexts inform. So Carlene Firmin, in her important work, 2015, highlights this, that living in a neighbourhood that's safe, that they go to school where they feel supported, they have a supported, safe peer group involved in activities that is safe, then they are likely to feel safe in their context and their environment. However, if they are going to school where they feel at risk, where they're bullied, where they're not protected by teachers and other staff there, if they feel in their own communities, if they are at risk in their own communities, in their local park, for example, in their building blocks where they live, then this is going to put that young person obviously at extra risk, and the context of that of the risk is really important for social workers and other key professionals to be mindful of and to be thinking about how we can build protective factors and mitigate the risk factors that young people face. Typically, social workers for many years, 2000 in fact, and I was social worker 10 or 12 years, we would use the framework for the assessment of. But suffice to say that there's a big focus in the framework for assessment of child in need on parenting. Really important. Now, of course, there is the family environmental factors along the bottom there that you'll see, but again, there's quite a lot of focus on the family history and functioning. So it might be the parents' experience of being parented, the wider family, again, very much family-based, housing. So there we see housing, one could adapt it, and community resources to start thinking more about the context, but really a focus very much on the family. And again, on the child's developmental needs, again, a strong focus on the family and social relationships. Education is there, but very much within the context of the family is an important consideration. And I guess when we look at the ecological perspective, acknowledgement that, of course, the child and the family are important, but the social context and environment that they live in. Firmin builds on this further by saying it's really important to the home and the home use, neglect, are there issues around parental custody? And also important to consider other peer group. Is there intimate peer violence, for example, in their peer group? Is there sexual offending amongst their peer group, harmful sexual behaviour potentially? And then we move out to the school. Is the school a safe place, or is there bullying going on in the school? Are there issues around sort of corridor culture, issues around safety in the school? And increasingly in some of the places where the contextual safeguarding team is getting embedded, social workers and other professionals are working with schools to carry out assessments to ascertain the extent to which they're safe places for young people. And then finally, Carlene talks about the neighbourhood and whether the area is a safe area for young people. What are the local parks like? What's the local housing provision like? And of course, throughout this, we have the spectre of the internet. So the extent to which social media, Facebook, these sorts of things, how safe or not does the young person feel in those online? You know, are they getting harassed online at night when they get home? All these things are very important to consider for social workers when assessing. And if you want more detail about contextual safety, I recommend really is watching a very good TED Talk on contextual safeguarding, rewriting the rules of child protection. Just a few more things about contextual safeguarding so we're really clear about what we mean by contextual safeguarding. This is from the contextual safeguarding website. That's really good. It highlights there's 4 key elements. This is 4 key elements to contextual safeguarding. Targeting, safeguarding partnerships should seek to identify and assess and intervene in social issues. So not just focusing on the parents, we need to be targeting and working with thinking about what are the locations. So what are we doing about a local park to make it safe? What are we doing about if there's a takeaway or a shop where we think young people are potentially at risk? Working alongside other key professionals, it might be park wardens, police officers, might be a railway station, working alongside colleagues who work at the railway station to make sure those places are safe for young people. Legislative framework. So welcome that contextual safeguarding was mentioned in Working Together 2018, and it's very much there in the new Welsh draft Welsh child sexual exploitation guidance that is due to come out very soon, and indeed the initial guidance that's already out, but maybe not strongly enough yet, particularly in England, but also we'll see in Wales. Is there specific enough advice there, and also at a local level around how safeguarding partnerships, how child protection agencies should work alongside each other to be bearing in mind extra-familial context and working to make locations safe. And that brings me on to the next point, which is around partnerships. The CS approach recognises that parents and carers have limited scope to influence the extra-familial context. So even the most caring, loving parents, if the young person is being bullied, being intimidated, being sexually harassed, physically harassed at school, what can they do to help keep them safe? It's very difficult, likewise in the community. And therefore, the approach Carlene recommends that safeguarding partnerships need to develop effective partnerships with agents in the local community that do have influence over the context. So really important that social workers build up relationships with people like park wardens, transport providers, shop owners, taxi drivers, these sorts of professionals to work alongside them to try and make sure more of the local community where we're working are safe for young people. And then finally, important to be measuring outcomes. So Carlene gives the example, sort of talks about an incident in a stairwell where a young person, where there'd been a number of serious incidents in the stairwell, which led to some of these young people being moved away from home, moved into away from their communities in an attempt to keep them safe. But there was no, despite a number of incidents over a year or 2 years, there was nothing done with that stairwell, extra lighting, extra police, extra support to make that stairwell a safer place. So really important that we intervene with locations and we work hard to make them safer, and we measure that. Have there been less incidents in the park, less incidents in that takeaway, for example? Okay, and again, I put the link there to the website, Contextual Safeguarding, HTTPS. Please go to that link. Excellent resources there. Okay, so this issue about extra-familial harm or parenting, which I would say is a big issue. Too much focus historically just on parenting. Of course, parenting is essential, but when we're working with adolescents, we need depth. And this is from a good blog, Need for Children's Social Care. At the moment, there's very little in the way of statutory guidance on dealing with abuse. Working Together was originally written with a focus on keeping children safe within the family. There is some move in the latest edition, she acknowledges, in that towards being more aware, and there's a page or so on contextual safeguarding and some other elements that relate to contextual safeguarding, but we need more detail. Some local areas are delivering their own approaches to managing risks outside the family. However, local partners do need more clarity. I think what she's getting at there is from central government about what is expected of them. So really important. But next, Working Together, the new guidance in Wales as well is much clearer around extra-familial harm and how local authorities and key agencies should be working with those young people. And there's a particular issue around various different research done, and Carlene raised this issue as well. About where we are working with families where there's a child at risk of significant harm and parenting. Now, normally in that situation, you'd expect probably a child protection need plan, probably a child protection plan, or in Wales, the child be made subject to the child made on the child protection register, because that's still the child protection register in Wales. But what happens where the child is at risk of significant harm, extra-familial harm, but there's no concerns about the parenting? And that is where there's a real gap, considerable variance amongst how different local authorities, different areas work with those young people, where the parents are seemingly doing what they can, or at least not risk themselves, the children, and yet we know these young people at risk, and different local authorities are working with these young people in different ways. I remember when I was a social worker and a principal social worker in 2 authorities, there's inconsistency across the country in relation to this, so we really need to think about how we tighten up and improve practice in this area. I'm now going to feed back on the research that I carried out with 2 colleagues at University. We went and visited 2 local authorities, one in Wales and one in England. We carried out a number of interviews, 27 authorities with senior managers and social workers, and we asked them about their understanding of the contextual safeguarding approach. So in one, they had in England, they had a contextual team, and it was starting to be pretty well embedded. In the local authority in Wales, they were still looking at embedding it. They were very much aware of it, but they were still looking to embed it further. So at different stages in their journey, if you will. And we were interested in about what their views were of contextual safeguarding and the barriers and enablers of effective implementation. I was particularly interested in how it was implemented. We were interested in what were the strengths and challenges of the CS approach from the practitioners and senior managers' perspective. And this was the first independent research into the implementation of the contextual safeguarding approach that's been carried out. And we're looking at doing more studies in this area, because we really need to understand better how different approaches are implemented and the impact that has on children and their parents. An example there was, London Local Authority was 5 senior managers, Welsh Local Authority, 2 senior managers. We did want to interview some young people, and we did have some set up in the London Local Authority, but they didn't manage to go ahead. But we are looking at doing some interviews over the next 6 months or so with young people at risk of extra-familial harm around their experiences of contextual safeguarding and other. Okay, so what were the key findings from this research we carried out? The key positives were that practitioners in both local authorities discussed the mapping of peer groups and locations, so they were starting to. They found it helpful to gain understanding of links between risks and the perpetrators in particular locations, so stairwells, parks, takeaways. In one local authority, they were working with railway stations, takeaways, park wardens. However, more work, including training, was needed to try and ensure, this is the English local authority, a more consistent and effective response. There was still work to do, but they were building relationships with this USET partner agencies, and that was real. This is a quote from a blog that a colleague and I wrote for the network. So there are promising examples of professionals from both creatively and collaboratively with completely new partners to identify, assess, and the extra-familial context. The contextual safeguarding approach requires a wider range of actors, including fast food worker, the bus driver. We were starting to see this, and that's very much. This is a quote from a team manager in the English authority. Now the shift is we're seeing this as a community issue. We're really utilising the kind of everyone's responsibility. So we tap into the local shops, bespoke training to housing association, firefighters, railway stations. Some of the challenges important to be mindful of, real challenges. Do social workers have the capacity to work in this new way? Big potential issue that was raised, particularly. They had high caseloads, which made the extra work required in terms of carrying out assessments, locations, work, writing assessments, interventions and plans, intervening with a park, intervening with a school, filling out the necessary paperwork, having meetings. It's going to take extra time, and if you've not got any extra money to do this work, that's a real challenge. I'll come back to that. That was a key finding from our research. Senior managers and social workers felt there needed to be a change in national legislation, both Wales and in England. There needs to be a clear national framework as to how we work with young people at risk of extra-familial harm. Because the current national guidance, both in England and Wales, focuses much more on parents, doesn't consider those extra-familial risks. And some issues in terms of role confusion. So which agency should take the lead? Was it the social workers? Was it housing? Was it early help? Some real confusion there about who should lead this work. Other challenges around implementation. So the expertise and the understanding of staff. Most social workers don't have teaching on recently being taught on to new AS qualified social workers, but if you qualified 5-10 years ago, you wouldn't have had training in it. And again, practitioners still very focused on the comfortable with. That's what their training focused on. That's what the national guidance focuses on. So that's where they felt comfortable. Senior managers, interestingly, particularly in the London Authority, but also in the Welsh Authority, were more focused on peers and context and more open to this approach, but it was taking a while to bed in. And I just think it's important to think about implementation of it. Research on the implementation of guidance and interventions in the States says the greatest impediment for providing evidence-based care is limited research and knowledge relating to policy implementation. All very well saying that a particular intervention or a particular method works with the young people. Have we properly considered about how it's implemented in different places? So you may well have an intervention, family support service, for example, that works in one area, or signs of safety approach. It might be your family group conferences that seem to work in one area, but then in another area they don't work so well. family nurse partnerships seem to work very well, for example, in the States, when they came over to this country, less effective when there were randomized control trials carried out. So really important to think about how the new policy, the new approach, the new way of working works alongside the culture in the organization, leaders, the frontline staff, and the impact it has. And this introduction of a new policy, a new way of working into a complex system and how they work together is something which I don't think we think enough about. So really important to think about this process of policy implementation. It's very complex. There are facilitators and barriers to this process of implementation, and different organizations are likely to react to new policies in different ways. And very important, therefore, to consider the ways in which policies are implemented and the impact they have in different areas. And if we look at Baginski's important work looking at frameworks and how they are implemented effectively, she led work around science safety, but I think it's, and this is a quote from her. Practice framework must be developed from a clear theoretical knowledge if meaningful. So there needs to be a clear theoretical knowledge. So we'd say with contextual safeguarding, there is clear theoretical knowledge behind it, so that's positive. Effective implementation requires the interaction, collaboration, and participation of stakeholders at multiple levels of an organization. So we need people at all different levels of the organization to buy into this approach. It's unlikely that a practice framework or an approach will embed into the organization's culture and practice unless you've got buy-in from people at all different levels of the organization. And unless the practice framework is embedded within the organizational culture, then it's very unlikely that there will be long-term change and long-term positive outcomes. And therefore, we need proper resources to be spent. So it's very difficult to use a new approach, whether it's contextual safeguarding, science safety, or any other new approach to working without it being properly resourced. You know, Baginski would say a one-day training course, for example, is not enough. We need to have repeated training and supervision to support workers to absorb and embody this new way of working. And I guess a question when we're looking at the implementation of contextual safeguarding or a new policy or a new guidance or science safety is there enough commitment from senior managers and indeed from frontline staff to really embed it? And if there isn't, it's likely to be unsuccessful. So when we look back at our research, our findings, and relate it back to what we were just talking about in Baginski's work, the English local authority and indeed the Welsh local authority to an extent, the social workers had a good grasp of the theoretical underpinnings of contextual safeguarding, so that was positive. Senior managers reported shifting the organizational culture was a significant challenge. They didn't have any resources in either of these extra two authorities, not extra resources to embed the contextual safeguarding approach. So that was a problem, no extra money, often facing cuts and ongoing austerity. And contextual safeguarding did not have buy-in from all relevant professionals, so it might, there wasn't widespread training and take-up by key professionals like the police, for example, other colleagues. So really important that you have all the main professionals involved. Really important to have that. And there seem to be different perspectives from frontline staff and senior managers. So frontline staff still focused a great deal on extra-familial context, whereas senior managers senior managers were more focused on extra-familial context, whereas peer groups and risks in the community, where social workers would still go to the comfort zone, if you like, of what's the parental capacity and whether the child is safe at home. And I think this is a really good quote from this study. This is an interview with a social worker. I think every local authority jumps on a bandwagon because we don't know if contextual safeguarding is going to be around next year, because actually we've had early intervention, early help a couple of years ago, and actually that term only stayed for a certain period. I'm a bit skeptical about it. The local government, as a wider government, they really need to think about concepts and actually give it enough time to embed into local authority. They invest so much money and so much energy by professionals and people, but actually they don't allow the resources and things to really embed. And in some local authorities, I've worked and carried out research, they'll bring in the science safety approach, then they'll bring in the contextual safeguarding approach, then they'll bring in another framework, and then there'll be a change of senior managers, a new director come in and say, well, no, I don't want to support that anymore. I've got my own, I believe in systemic practice or whatever it is. And unfortunately, this can happen where you've got lots of different frameworks, lots of different things seen as the new answer. And of course, there is no one thing that's suddenly silver bullet that's suddenly going to sort all these issues. Of course, the contextual safeguarding approach has some real strengths, but it's still relatively early days in terms of how effective we really know. Does it make a difference to young people? Are we certain that it makes a difference? Now, until there's more robust external evaluation of the contextual safeguarding approach, including ideally some sort of quasi-experiment or randomized control trial, where we can see if it's working compared to a control group, it's very difficult to say for certain its effectiveness, I would say. Some people may disagree with that. Some people might say it's some qualitative research saying that it's working well is enough. I would say, in my view, that's not good enough evidence necessarily. But that's a good discussion to have. Okay, so further challenges in relation to implementation that we found in this study. Do social workers have the capacity to consider all the environments where a young person spends their time? Important question. Are all the peers a young person may interact with outside the family home? Do they have a chance? There's questions around sharing of information, questions about, parents who's invited to meetings, which young people are invited to meetings. Do social workers have the capacity to carry out assessments and interventions of not just families, but of peer groups and contexts which may increase the prevalence of harm, such as parks, trains, and even schools? Well, that's a big question, and we don't know the answer. In truth, senior manager in the London Authority has said this: I think if you just turned up to a social worker and said, we're really concerned about this shop, have to go and do something about it, that would be overwhelming. Like if I was a social worker, like, what the hell do you want me to do? This goes back to the training and the capacity issue here. Do social workers have the training, the confidence, the capacity, the time to start? And if not, what? We have key issues here around the implementation of this approach, around capacity training, competence of social workers to lead this work. And if it's not social workers leading this work, who should be doing it? Some big questions we need to be thinking about with in relation to the effective implementation of the contextual safeguarding approach. Final quote, final few quotes, this study then, in the context of child protection system, already high levels and overwhelming levels of bureaucracy, the contextual safeguarding approach requires liaising with multiple agencies, such time-laborious assessments and interventions may be perceived as an additional. We've seen youth service budgets really significantly cut, big pressures on youth services. There barely is a youth service left. So this extra time, laborious assessments and interventions may be perceived as additional pressure. Final quote then. Contextual safeguarding is all about partnership working. The strain on the services has hit other services as well. Youth services have been decimated. The police have faced labour intensive, needs everyone to buy in. That's the final bit there, looking at our research on the approach. Really good at prognosing and working out the problem. Of course, we need to be mindful of context. Finally then, what does work? So what does the evidence base? This is based on Scott et al., who carried out a review of systematic review of other research, particularly around child sexual exploitation. And what they found was that the quality of relationships, no surprise, quality of relationships is key to engagement with young people, and that trust building is the key foundation of effective direct work with young people at risk of child sexual exploitation. So it's really important we build up a relationship with young people, that there's a consistent worker in the young person's life, and they build up trust, because because it's going to be the key foundation of that effective work with young people at risk of child sexual exploitation. And you see, when I reflect on where I live in Bristol, I lived 25, 30 years in Bristol, 25 years, 37 years. But live in Easton and Eastville for the last 12 years, and there's areas, Stapleton Road, if we think about, not always been safe. David Blunkett came here when he was Home Secretary a long time ago, said it was one of the 10 most dangerous streets in Bristol. It's less, 10 most dangerous streets in the UK. I think it's a bit less dangerous now, but there's still some areas there, the large parts of Stapleton Road don't feel particularly safe. So, okay, you intervene with a takeaway, you intervene with a park. Do the young people just move to another area? How do we try and make the whole community safe? Well, for a lot of areas, that's a real challenge. We should be doing it. We should be trying to do it. But big challenge, big challenge. So the quality of the relationships with the young people, building up their confidence, supporting them, as well as the contextual stuff is really important. Involving young people in setting the agenda for meetings. So if we're having a contextual safeguarding meeting or a child protection conference or a child in need meeting or a looked after children meeting, really important they're involved in setting the agenda, really important they're involved in what time the meeting is taking place, who's going to come to the meeting. And also the pace of direct work will be going generally at their pace and it can help them buy in. Support needs to be flexible and high intensity when necessary. Young people and families need to have on-call support when they need it most. So, weekends, for example, really that support. And they really importantly need stability, continuity, and persistence. One key worker who cares. Finally, in relation to direct practitioners, what they need to do, David Chevy has done this, understand the state of mind of the young person. A lot of the young persons we work with may have low self-esteem, may feel they're sort of rubbish, they don't matter, particularly lovable. So, again, young people who've developed this internal model are more likely to reject. Don't be surprised, if young people are unlikely or not too keen on engaging with you, particularly if we think about that, a lot of young people have experienced a number of different social workers, a number of different professionals in their lives. It's a natural reaction to, in some way, reject the practitioner or say they don't want to engage, they don't want to work with you. So be mindful that there's a good reason for this, understandable reasons for this. Be aware of our own attachment experiences and how they may impact. So what's our own experience of childhood? Important to consider, maybe. The relationship with the practitioner is a key protective factor. So it's all about that relationship. The bottom line is good social work practice. So important to have a good, strong relationship with the young people you're working with. You need time to do that. Always try to be available, loving, caring, interested, responsive, sensitive, accessible. Aim never to be unavailable, unloving, uninterested, neglectful, hostile, rejecting, untrustworthy. So that's the end of the workshop. I hope you found that helpful. If you've got any queries, you can contact me at Cardiff University, Clive.Diaz, Diaz CP